bad business decisions, and a very bad health diagnosis led to former President Ulysses S. Grant's decision to write his memoirs. But it was his friend Mark Twain who made them financially successful beyond his wildest dreams. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. A couple of months after leaving office in 1877, Grant was 56 years old and still looking for adventure. He and his wife Julia took an extended worldwide vacation. This was not a small vacation. The Grants traveled to 19 countries over 2.5 years, from Europe to the Middle East and Asia, and it was also expensive. Grant was looking to make some money, but had a history of failed business ventures over the years. In 1881, Grant joined his son Ulysses S. Grant Jr., nicknamed Buck, in his investment company. Buck's business partner in his brokerage firm was financier Ferdinand Ward, who was perceived to be so talented he had earned the nickname the young Napoleon of finance. Ward and the elder Grant got along very well. As Geoffrey Ward described in his book about his great-grandfather, Ferdinand was a very plausible, charming, unobtrusive, slender person with a genius for finding older people and pleasing them. Grant invested $100,000 into the brokerage firm, about $3 million today, and became a full partner. The firm, now called Grant & Ward, benefited from Grant's name and Ward's skills. Grant even commented to friends that he was now worth $2.5 million, but that was only on paper. Friends, family members, and even famed editorial cartoonist Thomas Nast poured money into the firm. However, Grant was mostly disconnected from the business operations, often signing papers without reading them. That never turns out well. Unbeknownst to either Grant father or son, Ward was running the business as a Ponzi scheme. Ward claimed to have government contracts, a claim which gained further credence with the former president on board as a partner. Ward would use the same securities over and over again as collateral against loans. He would pay off old investors with the money raised from new ones, along with paying investors high interest rates. Some investors, such as the Grants, kept most of their funds in the firm, receiving 2 to 3% profits per month. While Ward's fraud remained undetected, he was taking money out of the firm, earning $9 million and buying a brownstone in New York and a palatial 25-acre estate in Connecticut. An economic depression had started in 1882, making it difficult for the firm to stay afloat as their investments were not performing. On May 4, 1884, Ward asked the elder Grant for a $150,000 personal loan, or about $4.7 million today. Grant asked his friend William H. Vanderbilt for the loan, which Vanderbilt obliged. The loan was too late. 2 days later, on May 6, 1884, the firm Grant & Ward collapsed, wiping out Grant and many others. This was one of the leading factors that led to the financial panic of 1884. Ward fled. Grant shared with one of his former West Point classmates, "When I went downtown this morning, I thought I was worth a great deal of money. Now I don't know that I have $1." Grant was not exaggerating by much. Grant had $80 to his name. His wife Julia had another $130. Kind-hearted strangers responded by mailing Grant checks. Desperate to pay his bills, he reluctantly cashed them. Eventually, Ward was caught and brought before the New York Supreme Court. During the trial, Ward showed no remorse for his actions, explaining he had to rob Peter to pay Paul. Ward was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He only served 6 years. 5 months after the collapse of Grant & Ward, Grant was dealt another blow. That summer, Grant suffered from severe pain in his throat. When it did not go away, he finally visited a doctor in October. Grant was diagnosed with throat and tongue cancer, most likely a product of his decades-long cigar-smoking habit. There was no treatment. Now Grant also had to face the terrifying prospect of leaving Julia a penniless widow. The Civil War general now undertook one final mission to save his family from impoverishment. In the late 1870s and 1880s, a growing number of Civil War veterans from all ranks of service and both sides of the conflict began telling their wartime stories to a larger audience through published memoirs. For many years after the Civil War, friends and family had encouraged Grant to do the same. Grant, believing he was a poor writer, refused. A former adjunct general of Grant's, Adam Badeau, had already written a 3-volume collection about Grant's generalship. "It's all in Badeau," Grant would often say. When the editors of Century magazine requested his participation in their Battles and Leaders of the Civil War article series, Grant politely declined. Long before his financial troubles and health diagnosis, Grant had finally agreed with Century magazine to a series of articles analyzing many of the battles he had overseen. Century paid Grant a flat author's fee of $500, or about $15,000 today, for each article. His first articles were terse and unexciting, but he improved quickly. The articles were well received by critics and the public. The prose did not contain the lavish language of the Victorian era, but was concise, clear, and intelligent. Grant was also candid, depicting his battles with both the Confederacy and his internal army foes. The editor of Century magazine suggested that Grant write a memoir, as General William Tecumseh Sherman had recently done, to great acclaim. With his new concerns about his family's financial situation after his death, Grant suggested they publish his personal memoirs serially and then in bound volumes. Century agreed and drew up a contract where Grant would receive 10% of the profits for every book sale. When Grant's friend Mark Twain heard about the deal about to be made, he felt he needed to save Grant from himself. He believed Century was taking advantage of Grant. Twain immediately traveled to Grant in New York City from his home in Hartford, Connecticut. Since before he was a famous author, Twain was a huge fan of Grant's. Their first meeting, however, did not go so well. Twain was in D.C. lobbying for the passage of a bill in 1870. His first book had recently been published, but Twain was not yet a household name. Twain was invited to the White House by a former colleague to meet President Grant. Twain recognized there was a power imbalance between the two. As Twain described the encounter in a letter to his wife, "I shook hands, and then there was a pause and silence. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I merely looked into the general's grim, immovable countenance a moment or two in silence, and then I said, 'Mr. President, I am embarrassed. Are you?' Their paths would not cross again for nearly a decade. In November 1879, Twain was invited to a dinner in Grant's honor in Chicago. After the meal, a series of speakers rained endless praise on Grant well into the night. Twain, the evening's final speaker, didn't take the floor until well after midnight. Rather than follow suit with more praise of Grant's talents, Twain proceeded to poke fun at the esteemed guest of honor. Fearful that he had offended Grant, Twain waited for a reaction. The group of men seemed shocked, but not Grant. He was the first to laugh, and when he was reintroduced to Twain at the end of the night, Grant clearly recalled their first meeting, responding, "Mr. Clemens, I am not embarrassed. Are you?" The two quickly became close friends. So it was no surprise when Twain arrived at Grant's New York City home on 66th Street. Twain arrived just as Grant and his eldest son, Frederick, were reading over the Century contract, pen in hand. Twain asked if he could read the contract first. After reading the contract, Twain declared that the terms of the deal, 10% of all sales, was insultingly low and exploited Grant's dire situation. Twain was absolutely positive he could secure a more favorable deal and asked Grant for his proxy in negotiations. Grant was reluctant to back out of the contract that he and the publishers had negotiated. He believed it would be dishonorable to back out of his contract after all details had been agreed upon and papers drawn up. Twain tried to convince Grant that he should investigate a different publisher. For example, Twain confessed that he received better terms from the American Publishing Company, which published many of Twain's books. Grant was still resistant to the advice when Frederick suggested that the contract be set aside while they investigated the facts behind Twain's advice. Grant felt loyalty towards the Century Company because of the work he had done with the company while writing his articles on the Civil War battles. Grant did agree, however, to listen to Frederick, and the contract was set aside for 24 hours. Twain wasn't sure he could change Grant's mind in one day, but he had a unique sales model planned. Twain would employ a team of door-to-door salespeople to sell through a subscription system. Twain was going to sell his new book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, through this same model. These upfront subscription fees would finance the publication of the book, reducing the risk to the publisher. This offered the author more leverage to negotiate a higher share of the sales. Plus, Grant would be able to collect some much-needed upfront cash. Grant was convinced and agreed to change publishers. The publisher Twain recommended was Charles Webster Publishing, a new publishing house started by the nephew of Twain's wife. It was also having its own money problems. Twain was a major investor, so the deal helped Grant but also helped himself. It is not known how large a role Twain's own financial difficulties played in his decision to intervene in the publication of Grant's memoirs, or in his suggestion that the former president use a publisher in which Twain was a significant investor. Nevertheless, the terms of the deal were much more generous for Grant. 70% of the profits, a $25,000 upfront advance, and living expenses. Grant had already started writing, but now with the deal in place, his sole focus was to finish his memoirs. And for several months, Twain was by his side, providing literary advice and proofreading the 50-plus pages Grant wrote each day, a pace he kept up for 4 months. The focus of Grant's memoirs are around his time serving in the Mexican-American and Civil Wars. There is very little written about his childhood, and nothing about his presidency. These war stories are ones he had recounted many times to his neighbors or in slow moments on the battlefield to fellow soldiers, often in terse yet eloquent language. When writing his memoirs, it was often a matter of repetition and polish, rather than trying to remember and organize his thoughts. Despite constant pain that often left Grant unable to eat, drink, or even sleep, Grant spent 5 to 7 hours writing each day with determination and fortitude. Wrapped in layers of clothing to keep his rapidly shrinking frame warm, he churned out page after page, all while newspaper headlines blared the latest updates about his impending death. While Grant was writing, 10,000 agents canvassed the North for sales orders using a 37-page script written by Twain himself. Many of these door-to-door salespeople were Union veterans dressed in their old uniforms. The 2-volume set was sold for $3.50 to $12, depending on the binding, or $110 to $400 today. As Grant grew more feeble, his doctors recommended a more welcoming climate and a peaceful setting to continue his writing. He and Julia moved to a friend's cabin in upstate New York at Mount McGregor in the Adirondack Mountains. When Twain visited Grant at the cabin, he brought some good news. He had already pre-sold 100,000 copies of Grant's memoirs. This was the moment that Grant knew the tide had turned and his family would be financially secured. But he also knew he still needed to finish writing. He was now more determined than ever. Grant's condition continued to worsen. Grant would have choking episodes that would only abate after he had vomited a large quantity of blood. When his hand was too weak to write, he would dictate his thoughts to a stenographer. Later, he was unable to speak, so he picked up the pen again. Unable to walk, Grant was also too weak to sit without being propped up in his chair. Grant's doctors gave Grant morphine only sparingly in order to keep his mind clear for writing. They would swab his throat with cocaine to provide topical pain relief and use hypodermic needles to inject him with brandy during the worst of his coughing fits. Through it all, Grant persisted in honing his manuscript, editing, adding new pages, and poring over proofs of his first volume. As he sat on the cottage porch, on even the steamiest of days, swaddled in blankets, a wool hat, and a scarf covering his neck tumor, which was now as big as a man's 2 fists put together, according to the New York Sun. Grant's son Frederick and others aided in fact-checking the memoirs. One of those others during the early writing was Adam Badeau, an author and former Army officer who had served on Grant's staff during the war. Badeau left before the project was complete, having disputes with Grant and his family over how much he was going to be paid and how he would be credited for his research, editing, and fact-checking. Before the book was even published, Badeau, feeling he was not being given proper credit, started spreading rumors that Twain ghost-wrote Grant's memoirs. Eventually, these rumors made their way to the newspapers. Grant woke up on the morning of April 29, 1885, to read that he was not the author of his own memoirs. Grant felt that he must respond. He emphatically replied in a widely printed letter that the work on the memoirs was entirely his own. All of the handwriting drafts prove that they are in Grant's hand and not in Twain's. There are also details in the memoirs that only Grant would know, and yet the rumors persist today. In mid-July 1885, probably sometime between July 16th and July 20th, Grant put down his pen, having completed his 300,000-word manuscript. There is nothing more I should do to it now, and therefore I am not likely to be more ready to go than at this moment, Grant wrote. Within a week, on July 23rd, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant passed away at the age of 63, having secured his family's finances. Twain's army of 10,000 door-to-door salespeople sold more than 300,000 copies, even outselling Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Julia Grant's first royalty check was for $200,000, the largest royalty check ever written up to that time. Over the first 3 years of publication, Julia received $450,000 in royalties, equivalent to $15 million today, making her one of the wealthiest women in the United States. The personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, sold in 2 volumes, were not only commercially successful, but Grant contemporaries and scholars of today believe Grant's memoir to be one of the finest memoirs ever penned by an American president, even if it didn't talk about his presidency, and perhaps one of the foremost military memoirs in the English language. Despite the millions earned from Grant's memoirs and Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Charles Webster Publishing did not survive, folding 10 years after Grant's death. Grant's family and friends were convinced that he willed himself to stay alive to complete his memoirs, but it must have also provided him some solace in the difficult days at the end of his life to recount his glorious victories during the Civil War. Thanks for watching.